Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed, and today we're going to be continuing our Space Marines chapters videos with the Raven Guard, one of the most requested videos we've had so far. Now, the Raven Guard don't get enough love in the lore, I feel. There are a few books about them, but they tend to be a little bit sidelined for other more mainstream chapters. So I thought it would be good to go over today and illuminate some of their background. Now, the Raven Guard were originally the 19th Legion of the Space Marines, and their Primarch was Corvus Corax. Now, their homeworld is the Moon of Deliverance, previously named Lycius, which orbits above a hive world known as Kaivar, during the Istvan V drop site massacre, where landing Space Marine forces during the Horus Heresy were attacked by their allies and their forces devastated in a traitorous pincer movement, which I will talk about more during the Heresy videos. Now, the Raven Guard are one of the few Space Marine chapters that actually specialise in guerrilla warfare, moving behind enemy lines with unrivaled stealth and able to strike with precise applications of force, which means they are one of the very few chapters which specialise in the stealth role that their scouts tend to take on themselves, which is, with a caveat being, they're as stealthy as you can be as an 8 to 9 foot tall superhuman wearing power armour. Now, their chapter master is actually unknown, and I'll discuss why that is later on. However, we do know that on Deliverance, their fortress monastery is known as the Raven Spire. Now, they do have known chapters descending on them, although there are very few, and I'll mention the reason why later. But the known chapters descending from the Raven Guard are the Black Guard, the Dark Eagles, the Death Eagles, the Death Spectres, the Flame Eagles, the Hawk Lords, the Imperial Talons, the Knights of the Raven, the Raptors, the Revilers, the Stormhawks, the Stormwings, and some say the Carcharodons or the Space Sharks. Now, as always, I'll give you their battle cry, and that is Victorus aut Mortis, for victory or death. A very popular Space Marine saying, as well as being the Raven Guard's battle cry. Now, their history goes back to the Great Crusade, obviously, as they are a first founding legion. Now, we don't know much of what happened between the Emperor and Corax when they eventually met up on the world of Deliverance, as it was now known, after Corax helped liberate the planet from the evil tech overlords of the nearby planet of Kaivar. All we know is, for a day and a night, the Emperor and Corax sat in a meeting together, and eventually they emerged with the Corax saying he would leave Deliverance to lead his legion. Now, the Raven Guard, even back then, were known as experts in guerrilla warfare, infiltration, and using strike forces behind enemy lines. Their lightning-fast strikes usually took an enemy so by surprise that they didn't know they were being assaulted from within until after the battles were over. Now, although this is a very effective tactic, it did mean that the Raven Guard did get into conflict with a lot of their more honour-oriented brothers, who preferred to go straight into battle head-on as opposed to sneaking around behind the enemy lines, as many saw that as being an unworthy behaviour for Space Marines and Primarchs. This actually included Horus's Lunar Wolves themselves, although we don't know exactly what Horus's opinions on the Raven Guard were beyond a few choice statements. Now, during the Heresy, as I've mentioned, the Raven Guard actually responded to the Istvan III crisis by deploying with many of their brother legionaries from other legions to Istvan V in order to deal with the traitors directly. However, this is called the Drop Site Massacre for a reason. When they landed, the Raven Guard specifically went ahead with elements of the Imperial Army in order to start assaulting the traitorous forces on the ground. However, they were not to know that among their allies were actually traitors, so as they went forward, the guns of the Iron Warriors were turned upon them and caused massive damage to the legion of the Raven Guard. In fact, during this battle, their legion of 80,000 Space Marines was reduced to a legion of 3,000. The death of 77,000 Raven Guard upon that world was a black mark in the chapter's history that even 10,000 years later they struggled to recover from. Now, after the initial drop site massacre, the Raven Guard fought a running retreat, Corax himself knowing that they couldn't stand up against the might of all the legions that were arrayed against them. Now, they fought a running retreat for many days until a single Raven Guard battle barge arrived, known as the Avenger, to retrieve the Raven Guard and some of their allies and take them away from the Istvan system. Now, due to his losses, Corax realised that he couldn't just return to Deliverance. He had to go to Holy Terror itself to report what had happened as much as to actually ask the Emperor for help. So when he arrived, he of course spoke to Dawn, who was the regent at the time, and he begged Dawn to help him in restoring his legion with gene technology. Now, Dawn was skeptical at the time, but the Emperor actually communicated at this point with Corax and Dawn, letting him know, as well as letting Malcador know, that the Raven Guard should be restored using the gene technology that the Emperor used himself to create the Space Marines. Now, with the guidance of the Emperor, Corax went to the Lunar Vaults, a massive labyrinthine containers of where where much of the technology on Earth was being preserved. From there, he was allowed to take the gene technology back to Deliverance, along with the rest of his legion and some elements of the Adeptus Custodes to actually protect the gene technology in case of any infiltrations from traitors. Using this technology, which was used by the Emperor to create the Space Marines, Corax was able to use his own DNA in order to combine it with that of a usual Space Marine gene seed and create new warriors much more rapidly than you would normally be able to as a Space Marine. In fact, the Space Marines he created were almost a step forward in Space Marine creation, because unlike the Emperor, he had direct access to a lot of his own DNA, whereas all the Emperor had was genetic codes on file when the Primarchs were taken in the early days. These new Space Marines were called the Raptors. They then later became the forebears of the chapter of the same name. Now, the Raptors were a very effective fighting force, and so effective in battling traitors, in fact, that they were heard of by the enemy, namely Omegon, twin brother of Alfurius, and they were the twin Primarchs of the traitorous Alpha Legion. Now, they were on Kaivar, stirring up a rebellion against the Raven Guard in order to further their traitorous aims. Omegon, realising what the Alpha Legion could do with that technology, managed to infiltrate Deliverance and steal the pure gene technology with many of their warriors, replacing it with a tainted technology that left many of the new recruits of the Raven Guard devolving into insane, vile monsters who killed and murdered during a rebellion on Kaivar that was instigated by the Alpha Legion. Now, obviously, the still sane brothers of these Raven Guard were worried and disturbed by this change. Many of those new recruits were taken back to the Raven Spire and imprisoned or even killed because their insanity or mutation was so grotesque. Now, Corax was deeply saddened by what had happened to his new sons, and of the failure of himself to repair the damage done to his legion. Now, with the little gene tech they had left on file that wasn't tainted by the Alpha Legion, they were able to produce a usable new gene seed. However, it would still contain several small elements of mutation that would mean the Raven Guard were noticeably distinct from their brothers, with very pale skin and very dark eyes. Now, as I've mentioned, Corax was deeply saddened by what had happened to his sons, and he locked himself away for a very long time. He eventually did emerge from the Raven Spire, only to tell his sons he was leaving. At that point, he then left Deliverance, never to return. And much speculation has occurred as to what happened after he left Deliverance. Now, I'm going to go into more detail during my Corax video, which will be part of the Horus Heresy series, so I'm not going to go into any more detail here. Now, that's the potted history of the Raven Guard. After Guilliman came up with the Codex Astartes, they actually fit quite well into that structure, although there was initial resistance because there was such a small number of them left. In fact, they were able to divide themselves equally between 3 new chapters, one retaining the old name of the Raven Guard. Now, after all this time, the Raven Guard still are quite a small chapter and struggle to maintain high numbers due to their nature of being very careful with who they select to be sure not to pick up any genetic impurities to further compound the damage done to their gene seed. Now, they have taken part in many notable actions, including helping the Ultramarines during the invasion of Ultramar. Now, I'm going to go into more detail about their culture and organisation in my next video, so that is everything I wanted to say on the history of the Raven Guard in this video. Now, do keep voting, although I think next up will be the Iron Hands chapter. We will then be starting our Imperial Guard videos, so we'll be going to be inserting News to Space Marine Chapters videos alongside the Imperial Guard videos. Now, as always, if you've got anything else you'd like to see, do let me know. Specifically this time, anything from the Imperial Guard that you've ever wondered about, anything about them that you think is either irregular or that needs explaining, and we'll see if we can deal with those first up for you. So look out for the Iron Hands video coming up next, and we'll see you next time on the Vaults of Terra.